In this case, by science, we mean especially physics, mathematics, the more abstract part of scientific methodology and scientific research. And the relationship between these two fields are, of course, very long. There are many books, and even there is a separate discipline, a separate science dealing with this the relationship between science and religion. It's called the philosophy of science, and philosophers of science often deal also with religion and the problem of religion or the divine world. That this is the main problem in scientific method. How can we unite the scientific method with the religious worldview and the religious methodologies, if it's possible or not? That was the main question. And of course, uh, in this problematic relationship between science and religion, the main question was always the existence of the divine agency. Is there any divine presence in scientific methodologies? Can we prove scientifically the existence of the divine world? So that was the problem, the discussion or the conflict sometimes between religion and science. And this problematic relationship begins in antiquity. Of course, everything begins in antiquity, and actually they reached a very advanced level in this discussion and problematization between religion and science. And from from the topics which we can discuss in between religion and science, there are many subgroups, and it's a huge variety of problems we can deal. I choose the problem of cosmogony, the problem of the creation of the world, because it is a very intriguing, a very interesting problem. How this world was created, who created the world, and how can we understand the process of creation. Um, of course, there are many other studies. The beginning of the life, for example, the evolution. It's another topic. Genetic, biology. So there are many fields which we can discuss and to analyze the relationship of science and religion. But I choose one case study, and that is the cosmogonies, the creation of the world or the universe, the entire universe. Of course, in ancient times, the people gave uh, popular answers for this problem. Obviously, they were always curious how the world was created, why are we here, how we get here, why we are living so shortly, 60, 70, 80, 90 years, the longest living person on earth we can attest was 122 years, 121, a French woman. So why we are limited in times, why our life is limited, and why the earth is obviously much older. It was obvious since always for human beings that the earth where we are living is much older than a human lifespan. But how it was created. So obviously this was one of the earliest questions. Homo sapiens, the philosopher person, the philosopher man asked since prehistoric times how the world was created, and what are the processes, the mechanisms which creates this everything we see. What's the relationship between the Earth where we are living and the stars? Are they far? Are they close? How far are they? These were questions which we have since at least 3,000 years. But obviously, the answer of the ancient societies were mostly mythological. It was we know very well the famous mythologies of Egypt, Mesopotamia, especially from Sumer, the Sumerian cities, but as also very well known Greek myths and legends on the creation of the world. In most of the cases, very interestingly, in most of the cases in comparative religion, we know this from almost 200 years now, that most of the ancient cosmogonies, the creation myths, have has a common point, and that is the creation from nothing. Before creation, there was nothing, or before creation, there was the word. It's, in the Jewish traditions, Judeo-Christian tradition, or there was nux, as the Greek mythology said, which means an eternal darkness, or there was an ever-floating huge ocean of nothing, as the Egyptians said. So there was something before the creation which is eternal and silent. So somehow every single ancient cosmogony associated the primordial times with something non-dynamic, which is something which is not moving, and which is or dark or without any movement, any dynamical activity. So something which is eternal and ethereal. After this, something happened. God or some gods, obviously in polytheistic religions, there are many persons who has a role in a certain role in cosmogonies. But even in polytheistic societies, there is a primordial God who is doing something very important. It can be simply by the act of creation, or in Egypt there are many variations, even some sexual activities of the gods, for example, which creates the first living beings. In other mythologies, the word of the god is creating everything. So the divine power enters in this huge darkness of nothing, and after that, uh, the world is created: the skies, the stars, the planets, and then the earth, and then every living being on the earth. And finally, obviously, the humans are also created as the coronation of this cosmogony. So in most of the cosmogonies of ancient times, we are speaking about a linearity. There is a linear, chronologically well-defined cosmogony, which begins with nothing, with darkness, a non-dynamic, non-moving something. Then comes the divine agent. It can be one or many gods. And then there is a hierarchy of creation. First, usually the sky, the stars, the uh, outskirt of the planet, so something which is far from us. But they always associated the sky with something much more primordial. And then comes the earth, the moon, of course, the earth, and then every living being on earth, uh, natural and geographical elements on the earth. And finally, as the last point and the coronation of the creation, is the human being, the Homo sapiens, is also created. So it's very interestingly, this model is valid from most of ancient cosmogonies, from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, from India, from Greece, and even in the Americas, in Latin American cultures or pre-Columbian cultures. This cosmogony is, has the same model. But this was the answer of most of the societies for thousands of years. Uh, a big change occurred somewhere between 600, 500 BC and 200 AD. So in less than 700 years, or half a millennia, especially in the Mediterranean world, but not only in the Mediterranean world, also in India, very interestingly, in India and China, very interesting new philosophical answers were created for this problem. Karl Jaspers, the famous philosopher of the 20th century, he named this period, and also later Robert Bella, the famous historian of religions, They named this period between 600 BC and 200 AD as the axial age, period, which changed radically the human cognition and the human thinking about the world, the human perception of the world. And this radical reform or revolution, if you want, in human mentality is associated with the scientific and philosophical cosmogonies. Uh, it was an answer for the ancient, the very old types of cosmogonies, uh, a scientific version of how the world was created, a scientific quest to understand why we are here, how the earth was made, how old is the earth, how far are we from the sun, for example, what is the diameter of the earth, of the planet, what is the shape of the planet. So there was these questions were tried to be answered by scientific methods. So the the big revolution of these philosophers of ancient Greece and India, especially, are not only by the fact that they are asking curious questions, but the methodologies used by them was radically different. They were not theological answers, but they were scientific methodologies used to measure the time, to measure the earth, to measure distances and so the space itself, the mathematical three-dimensional space, and even the four-dimensional space, because time was also very important. So the four-dimensional space as a notion, it already existed in ancient Greece. So obviously, these people, the big philosophers of antiquity, they knew also the old answers, the ancient cosmogonies, and they get in conflict with these two worlds, religion and science. The first time when, on mental level at least, we will find a conflict between the old mythologies and myths of creation, and the new answers of these scientists. Uh, well, this conflict was not intense. It was obviously the works of the philosophers represented only the elite of the society. There were few hundreds of people in entire antiquity who knew about the results of the very famous mathematicians and physicians or philosophers of ancient society. 99% of the people they didn't even know about the results of Aristotle or Plato or the other famous thinkers. So unfortunately, it was a limited knowledge. It was a limited science, and most of the society, of course, was still living in this theological, mythological cosmogony, which was very limited. There are also some physical evidences from this scientific revolution in this period of the axial age. This is a symbol, a very important discovery of the 20th century. They discovered in the sea, in one of the near one of the islands in Greece. Uh, it's the so-called Antikythera mechanism. It's a very complex ancient computer, 2,300 years old computer. Obviously, computer where it's a similar structure what we have in our mechanic watches. Uh, this is a model how it looked like in full scale. Unfortunately, only the middle part was preserved. The box itself obviously was not preserved, unfortunately. But we this is after many years of research, they reconstructed. So the role of this object, for example, was to um, analyze the sky and to calculate the differences, the distances between the planets and their movements to have a much more precise calculation of the stellar sky. It was a very sophisticated version of the later, much easier, much portable version of the uh, yes, and this object which was used by the Arabic and early medieval navigators and also in the 15th century became much more used. But this is one of the earliest evidences of a stellar map used used for scientific measurement. So this was an important step because then humans, the Greek society, was able to measure not only on the Earth the distances between cities, the distances between countries, but also we have now a new dimension, an extraterrestrial dimensions. So we can go outside the planet, our planet, and to measure the distance between Earth and the Sun, for example. It was first time measured also in Hellenistic period in Alexandria by one of the philosophers of the Alexandrian library, the famous Museikon, the famous library of Alexandria, which was a scientific center at that time. It was a new temple. It was very interesting architecture. They used the same type of architecture in Alexandria to imitate the temples of the Greek society, of the Greek world. But instead of gods, you find their books and the portraits of the big thinkers, the big philosophers. So they intentionally created a new world, new gods, if you want, but instead of divine agency now those who are cited in these or those who are mentioned in this new temple are philosophers and mathematicians, physicians, thinkers. It was a very, very ambitious and very unique moment in human history, which obviously stops in the 4th, 5th century after Christ, when polytheistic societies are collapsed and Christianity monopolize also the human consciousness. So how we are thinking about the world, how we are thinking about the cosmogony, how the world was created. It was not allowed anymore to use these very advanced scientific technologies and then the scientific methods. So it was a great break in scientific history, or this relationship between science and religion stopped for some centuries between the 5th century and the 15th century, almost 1,000 years break. Some remarkable results from antiquity, as many of you know, Greeks were of course the most advanced in this field. Aristarchus, for example, another Hellenistic thinker, he predicted, he was not sure in his results, it was obviously only a theory, a hypothesis, which he was not able to measure exactly, but he was the first who claimed that our Earth is not the center of the solar system, of the system of planets, but the sun, which is much bigger, and it is the center of this planetary system. So all the other planets, the Moon, the Earth, the Mars, the Venus, the Mercury, and the Saturn and Jupiter, these 6 planets which were known by ancient societies, they were actually moving around the Sun. So he imagined a heliocentric solar system, planetary system, which was obviously he was not able to prove it. So he was lacking the scientific methodologies and technique to prove that this is possible. His theory was considered as a heretic theory, even in antiquity, because Ptolemaios, another Greek philosopher much later in Alexandria, in the Roman times, he fixed a new world of the solar system and the planetary system, which is centered by the Earth. So it's a Earth-centered world system, which all the other planets you can see here, the Moon, the Mercury, the Venus, the Sun, the Mars, the Jupiter, and the Saturnus, and all the skies, obviously, the stars and the constellations, which were well known in antiquity, were moving around the Earth. So this new model of the world, the spheres, he wrote in the Almagest. Well, this is of course, saved by the Arabic culture in the medieval time. So Ptolemaios' world was dominating the ancient and also even the medieval world. It was very useful because it somehow united the most of the cosmogonies. It was very compatible with the religious answers of ancient societies and Christianity too, because the outskirt, the most far and most primordial world, the stars, comes after the spheres of the planets, and the last, the coronation of this creation is of course Earth, and on the Earth the human being. So it somehow, this system of Ptolemaios, even if it's a scientific system, it reflects actually a religious world, a religious concept of this linearity of mythological creation myths and cosmogonies. So it was, if you want, a compromise between religion and science. This is why Christianity also accepted Ptolemaios' world and his new map, stellar map. It was used for more than 1,200 years. So it was one of the most successful scientific answers or methodologies. There were some researchers, some scientists who questioned, however, the existence of divine agents, the existence of divine interventions in this creation. We call them, of course, it's an anachronistic word to use, atheism for ancient times, but there were some skeptical movements in antiquity, especially the so-called peripatetic school, philosophers who were walking around in Athens, and they were analyzing the texts of Plato, especially, but even before Socrates. So the school, the after school of Socrates, the peripatetic school, there were many scholars from this movement, especially Strato of Lampsacus was the most radical philosophers of this movement. He is the first one, very interestingly, who claimed that the world, everything which we see here, see in the world, is created only by matter, materiality, and energy. So these two elements are in the movement, and they create new elements and new materialities without divine intervention. Of course, this idea was not well received, was not well accepted by even by Greek society. And after that, unfortunately, most of the books of Strato of Lampsacus now are missing. We have very few lines, actually, some parts of his books preserved by other philosophers. So we know his work only from some copies and fragments.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Very briefly, when we talked about the Greek atheists, and I don't want to get into like a long linguistic debate about this, but you said that the term is used anachronistically, but the word atheism has its root in ancient Greece. So why is it?
Of course, the word itself, it's a Greek word. It's a Greek word, but atheist as a movement. So we cannot imagine as an identity. As he himself, he didn't claim that he's an atheist. As Richard Dawkins claims. I mean, he's one of the, or others. So he didn't claim that Strato of Lampsacus, I am an atheist. We, the historiography, using this word to describe this movement. So the phenomena itself, of course, it's very similar, it exists, but somehow it's like using these modern terms such as feminism in antiquity, for example, or I don't know, other notions, modern notions, which we are using for our contemporary society, and we are going back in antiquity to postpone to use for other societies of pre-industrial societies or pre-scientific societies, the same etiquettes, the same boxes which we use today. He himself didn't claim that he's an atheist. We are using this word because his works are excluded the divine agent. Of course, probably he would be not offended if we use this word for him, because indeed the word itself, it's a modern notion, it's a modern creation formed with two Greek words. So it's obviously not incorrect to use the word for ancient society. So after this scientific revolution of the axial age, there comes a very long break, partially saved by the Arabic writers in the 8th, 9th, 10th century, and obviously also in the Frank Empire and the Merovingian period copied a lot of ancient works. So it's not really true that medieval times was a dark age, because the medieval monks and the Arabic culture didn't save most of the works of antiquity. Then we don't have that 5% of ancient knowledge they saved for us. So we need to contextualize this. But the problem was obviously that the scientific methodologies, the scientific liberty, especially of the ancient thinkers, was forbidden in medieval times. It was called heresy, witchcraft, and obviously we know very well that there were many trials, many legal trials, even with very famous scientists like Giordano Bruno, Galileo Galilei, and many others who suffered excommunication or even prison, or in most extreme cases, execution. But even if religion and the institutionalized version of religion had a problem, had a conflict with the scientific boom of the Renaissance period in the 15th, 16th century, it was inevitable. The religious institutions could not stop anymore the scientific emerge, and this scientific revolution which occurred after Copernicus, the Polish physician and scientist who finally proved with scientific methods that the solar system indeed is heliocentric, and the sun is in the center of our solar system. It was a very important step to understand, to go beyond the Earth, to understand that we are part of a much larger story, a much larger world. And that was a very, of course, it was a problem for religion and for religious institutions, because by questioning the old Ptolemaic world, Copernicus and his generation questioned also the importance of human beings, the importance of centrality of the divine, power. It was a big theological problem. How can we theologically unite these new results, scientific results, with very old theological systems? It's well known that Newton also revolutionized the physics, which already in 1662 in one of his letters mentioned that You can see here the citation that blind faith could never produce the wonderful uniformity of planetary movements. Gravity may put the planets into motion, but without the divine power, it could never put them into such circulating motions as they have. So Newton was interestingly not atheist, as we use this word now again for a much older society. He was not atheist. He was speaking about the divine power as an agent, as a very important factor in this harmony, in this wonderful uniformity, where gravity, of course, his big discovery, plays an important role. But without the divine power, motion cannot begin. So Newton understands that everything which moves in the universe, it moves because of gravity. He didn't know that there are many other forces, of course, they discovered later. But he thought that the very starting point, the very starting point, which the first movement, it needs a starter, it needs a big player, it needs a god or a divine power. This was his idea. He imagined a taste world where there is a divine agent which begins the movement, and he didn't really affect the movement itself. This book is really wonderful. You can find on internet with really fascinating studies and articles on this big problem of science and religion. Now the next step, of course, came when astronomers discovered that there is something much more than just the solar system. Of course, there are millions of stars outside, and they named it as they imagined these stars as an island or as a spiral island of stars called galaxies. The Milky Way, of course, was always visible on the sky. It was not something new. There are many myths and ancient legends from ancient times about how the Milky Way was created. But only in the 18th century, astronomers understand what is actually this phenomena and these millions of stars in an island of stars which creates a spiral island. And then after this, there was a question if there are more than just one galaxy. It was the big question, if can we go even further to understand how these galaxies, how these big islands of millions and billions of stars were formed. That was the next question. And that again pushed conflict between cosmogony and religion, because it's really pushed further and further this Earth-centered old concept of the world. A very famous moment, which somehow a culmination of a conflict between religion and science, was the famous Galileo affair in 1633, which made a conflict, of course, the condemnation of Galileo Galilei as a scholar, as a scientist. His entire work was forbidden and was put on the list of forbidden books by the Inquisition, and he was forced to live in self-exile and put in closed for entire his life. So it was a very unfair attitude for this great scholar. Unfortunately, we know very well that there's still an ongoing debate between the Catholic Church and science about this specific affair. Even if the Catholic Church, we will see, that radically changed his attitude towards science in the following few hundred years. But still, this problem of if Galileo should be so this affair should be condemned officially by the Catholic Church as one of their mistakes in the past. It still never happened. I mean, Joseph Ratzinger and the later Pope Benedict XVI in 2013, he didn't accept as a mistake of the church. He claimed that the church acted rightly in 1633. It's still an ongoing debate, so there might be a moment in history when finally the church accepts it as one of his mistakes, but somehow it still represents one of the most fragile and tensioned moments between science and the religious institutions, at least. Somehow, even if Galileo died in self-prison, in his home prison, and his works were forbidden for centuries, for more than 150 years, his works were forbidden till the end of the 18th century. His results and the revolution, the scientific revolution he made with Copernicus and other big astronomers, somehow reflected the result and the victory of science when the Vatican accepted in 1891 to build an astronomy, a Vatican observatory, and which of course had a scientific aim to understand the world and the stellar systems. So that was a very interesting moment in the Vatican when they built this observatory. Somehow it reflected that the church is open to a dialogue. It's open for a scientific discussion with the scientists. And this relationship, this dialogue, is the most famous case, well-known case, is between Edwin Hubble and Georges Lemaître. This Belgian scholar, he was a Jesuit priest, and the famous American astronomer Edwin Hubble. Both of them had very important contributions in this new age of physics after the revolution of Albert Einstein, who was very interestingly, when it comes to cosmogony, Einstein was very conservative. He didn't believe, for example, that the universe is expanding. He didn't believe that there are many other things outside our galaxy. Those who really made a revolution were Edwin Hubble, and for many years, physics and the scientific academic world were using exclusively the name of Hubble when it comes to the expanding universe and this model of the so-called Big Bang model. However, nowadays we know that in 1927, years before Edwin Hubble, this Jesuit priest, who was a brilliant physician too, he published a very important work in French, which is translated as a homogeneous universe of constant mass and growing radius, accounting for the radial velocity of extragalactic nebulae. So very shortly, this, which is online now, you can read the entire work of Lemaître. This extragalactic nebulae, which means a nebulae, it's this stellar island, from which new stars are forming, basically a baby stars. He discovered that their velocity, their light is different from every day. So there is a velocity, there is a movement of the light coming from these nebulae, and he claimed that this growing radius, the growing distance from these nebulae is an argument that the entire universe is expanding, it's constantly growing. And this was a revolutionary idea in the 1920s. It was radical even for Albert Einstein, who didn't believe that this Belgian physician has right, or this hypothesis can be proved. Of course, it remained a hypothesis for many years, even if in the 1940s and 50s, it became more and more obvious that Edwin Hubble and Georges Lemaître, they discovered the same thing, which we call now the Big Bang theory, the famous Big Bang theory, which argues that our universe has now around 13.7 billion years, and it all begins with a so-called inflation and this very singularity, which after that, this singularity, which is still not well understood, the very first seconds are still problematic to understand, but after actually through millions and billions of a second, it's still hard to understand what is happening there in that singularity, but it follows by this so-called inflation, which is now well documented by my measurements. And after this inflation comes an intermediary period of dark ages when the matter is still not well formed. And then the first stars at around 400 million years after this Big Bang begin to form. And from the stars and from these nebulae, we know very well what is happening after that. The formation of galaxies, the various types of stars, and from the stars and their matter, the planetary systems now around more than 1,000 planets are known exoplanets outside from our solar systems. So we know that there are thousands of planets outside. There are thousands and millions and billions of stars and star clusters, actually, not only galaxies, but galaxy clusters, big systems of galaxies, which are constantly expanding. You can see this model, it's constantly growing and accelerated galaxy universe. So this was the big discovery of Hubble and this priest. It was fascinating that in this moment, in the first half of the 20th century, a Catholic priest and an atheist scholar made the same discovery, and of course they know about their discovery. This Jesuit priest was later, of course, well acclaimed physician. He met also Einstein and many other famous scholars, so he was accepted in the scientific academic world. It was not considered as an outsider. He was well received as a scholar, even if his theory was proved only in the 1960s, when, of course, after his death, we had now the technological methodologies to use. The big problem was, after science accepted that Lamarck he was right, and this model is now the new model of cosmogony, which we know. So after this model was universally accepted in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, the big question was the reaction of religion, how religion and how religious institutions will react to this new model of cosmogony. And then, of course, the Pope, Pius XII, was forced somehow, well, he was urged to react. It was very urgent now that religion needs to react to this new model and the revolution, scientific revolutions of not only cosmogony but other scientific, especially the evolution and the problem of Darwin, which was still not clarified by the church. And this papal encyclica, the Humani Generis, published in 1950, was the first document which, of course, it was not a positive reaction of the church to the science. It was actually, it opened the debate, it opened a very, very violent, very intense, not violent, but intense dialogue between science and religion. But at least it was the first step to a new dialogue between science and religion. In this photo, you can see again Lamarck and the Pope. They had also very intense discussions how this physician and priest united his faith, his religiosity, with this new model of cosmogony, which he proved also scientifically and mathematically. It was their correspondence and their discussion is really a fascinating case study for for this dialogue between science and religion in the 1950s. Another person who tried somehow this unification of scientific revolution of the 20th century and to save religion and religious ideas and religious cosmogonies to unite with science was Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and many of his followers, like this Professor Frank Tipler, who is a physician, he's still alive. These two guys invented the so-called omega point and the idea of the multiverse. They believe also that they claimed, they hypothesized that there is a singularity, the initial singularity, which we call now the Big Bang, which goes in time for a final singularity, the omega point, which Teilhard de Chardin interpreted as the divine player in the cosmogony. So this singularity, the initial singularity, between the initial and the final singularities, there are many universes are created, but only few of these universes are are ideal to create life, to create the atmosphere and the factors where life can be evolved. Life, of course, needs big chemical structures. Life needs water. Life needs carbon. Carbon-based life forms are the basic of the life, at least as we know now. Of course, there can be many types of lives, still not, which we cannot understand. But there are very few. We are limited by the physics of life, like how life is created. Another physician who tried to unite religion and science was David Bohm. He worked together, for example, with the famous Indian philosopher Krishnamurti, and he very interestingly David Bohm united this the Indian philosophy with physics and try to understand the universality of the universe. He invented also the necessity of so-called theory of everything, which is now, of course, very well debated problem in physics, but in the 60s was considered as a pseudo-scientific notion. Now in physics, it became an official notion, the theory of everything, uniting quantum mechanics with the general relativity of Einstein, which is still a big problem in physics, how to unite the very small worlds, the micro world and the macro world. It's still a big problem. In 2016, Pope declares that the evolution and the Big Bang theory are real, and so it was again a new step in the dialogue between science and religion. They even organized an international conference in the Vatican to the memory of Lamarck, the famous Jesuit priest. So it's very interesting that at least on the level of the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church in Europe, there is a need, or there is an emerge of communication, dialogue between science and religion nowadays. As a last case study, this weak and strong entropic principle is now very fancy terms in modern physics, because the big question is, of course, if the Big Bang theory, what I presented, and the big discovery of Hubble and Lamarck is true, then the problem is still why there is life. Is life on Earth unique? Is life on Earth a necessity or just an accident? So these are still problems which we cannot answer with physics, with mathematics. But these two theories, the weak and the strong entropic principle, tries to give somehow an answer or to find a common ground for physics and religion. Especially the strong anthropic principle is claiming that the universe which we know today, this 13.7 billion years old universe, actually is the ideal moment for life. It cannot happen otherwise. Just this is the only version, the only way to create life, because if life is created, let's say 5 or 10 billion years before, the universe was way too hot. For example, it was not ideal to intelligent life forms. 10 or 15 billion years later, life will have probably other dimensions and other forms. So they try to understand this inevitability of the emergence of life and how God or a creator or a divine agent can fit in this model. Even very famous physicians like Bernard Carr wrote a book about the problem of universe and the multiverse, the existence of possible other dimensions and other universes which we still don't know, or we are not sure about their existence, or we cannot measure exactly. It's a very interesting, much, of course, a book of philosophy of science, not necessarily physics, about the existence of multiverses, which includes also the possibility of divine players, divine agents. And the other side was, of course, the famous Stephen Hawking and many other scholars like Richard Dawkins, who claims that the universe we know today and everything within the universe, even human beings and the Earth, which is absolutely not a unique planet, it's just part of the grand design, which is actually the physics, the laws of physics, which does not need a divine creator. So there are still ongoing debate. It's a very, very interesting and intense topic, and we will see how this will evolve. It's one of the most fascinating levels of discussions you can have about religion and science. It's the cosmogonies, how the universe was created and where is God in this story. There are many new discoveries in physics which physicians still use, very interestingly, religious terms, religious notions. For example, when they discovered the bosons, one of the smallest particles ever discovered, they used as the God's particle, or they use the notion of creation every time. So it's very interestingly that we still have a vocabulary of theology, the vocabulary of old, ancient, mythical cosmogonies used in physics. Somehow their model is is not so different when it comes to semiology and notions.